The evening air carried the crisp scent of pine, and the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden streaks across the quiet countryside. It should have been a peaceful night, but for one small child, it was anything but. 6-year-old Henry Marshall stood alone on the deserted road, his tiny chest heaving with sobs. His blue sweater was torn at the sleeve, his small hands scraped raw from where he had fallen. He had only meant to chase the fireflies that flickered like tiny lanterns along the edge of the forest. But now, as the darkness crept closer, he realized his mistake. He was lost. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. He had called for his grandfather, his only family, but no answer came. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, empty and silent. Henry wiped his nose on his sleeve, his little shoulders trembling with fear. He wanted to be brave, but the growing shadows made his imagination run wild. Then there was movement, a rustling in the trees, the sound of paws, heavy yet measured, moving in the soft earth. Henry's breath caught in his throat as he turned toward the sound. Emerging from the trees, their coats gleaming under the moonlight, came a pack of German shepherds. 5 of them, powerful and disciplined, their eyes alert. They moved in perfect harmony, forming a protective circle around the child. Henry's breath came in short gasps as he instinctively stepped back. His small hands dug into the dirt. Were they going to hurt him? One of them, larger than the rest, his fur a striking mix of black and tan, took a slow step forward. His eyes, wise and knowing, locked onto Henry's. His collar gleamed under the moonlight, a tag dangling from it. B.O.B. Bob was no ordinary dog. He had been a police 9, a protector, a hero. He had spent years by an officer's side, saving lives, catching criminals. But now, he was something else, a leader without a unit, a soldier without orders. And tonight, he had chosen to guard this lost boy. Bob sniffed the air, then lowered his great head and nudged Henry's shoulder gently. The boy flinched at first, but the nudge wasn't forceful. It was reassuring, steady. Another shepherd, a lighter-colored one with a small scar near his ear, let out a soft whine before stepping closer, his tail giving the faintest wag. The realization hit Henry. They weren't here to hurt him. They were here to help. His tears slowed as he looked at the intelligent eyes around him. "D, do you know where my grandpa is?" he whispered. Of course, the dogs couldn't answer, but Bob turned his head down the road, then back to Henry, as if gesturing for him to follow. Then, as if by some silent command, the dogs repositioned themselves. 2 moved ahead of Henry, 2 took the rear, and Bob remained right at his side. They were leading him somewhere. Henry hesitated, but something in Bob's calm gaze, something warm and reassuring, made him trust. So he followed. They walked in silence, the dogs padding beside him like silent sentinels. The night was cool, but Henry didn't feel as scared anymore. Every few steps, Bob glanced at him, making sure he was keeping up. It felt almost like walking beside a guardian angel. Then, in the distance, a light. Henry's heart leapt as he saw the familiar glow of his grandfather's lantern. The old man was on the porch, his weathered face creased with worry as he scanned the road. "Grandpa!" Henry cried, breaking into a run. The old man's head snapped up, and he stumbled forward as Henry rushed into his arms. "I got lost, but the dogs found me." Henry's grandfather held him tight, his hands trembling. Then he looked up at the pack of German shepherds. Bob stood at the front, his deep brown eyes calm and unwavering. The old man's breath hitched. "Bob?" Bob tilted his head ever so slightly, as if recognizing him too. Henry's grandfather let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head in disbelief. "I know this dog," he murmured. "Years ago, he was a K-9 officer. He saved my friend's life during a robbery, but that was a long time ago. I heard he retired." Henry blinked up at the shepherd, then at his grandfather. "You mean Bob was a hero?" The old man nodded, stepping toward the dog. He reached out a hand, hesitated, then rested it gently on Bob's head. The shepherd leaned into his touch, just slightly, but enough to say yes. The other dogs lingered for a moment, then, as if sensing their job was done, turned back toward the woods. One by one, They disappeared into the shadows, all except Bob. Henry looked up at him, his small fingers gripping the dog's thick fur. "Can he stay, Grandpa?" The old man exhaled, then gave Bob a long look. "I think," he said slowly, "Bob has already made his choice." And from that night on, Bob was not just a dog. He was family. But something in the way the dogs moved, their calm presence, made Henry feel safe. With a deep breath, he wiped the last of his tears and slowly stood up. As soon as he did, Bob let out a short, sharp bark, one that echoed into the distance. Then, far away, a reply came, a human voice shouting his name. Henry's eyes widened. That was his grandfather's voice. The K9S had done more than just find him. They had called for help. With renewed hope, Henry took his first step forward, surrounded by his unexpected rescuers. What happened next would shock everyone. Henry's heart pounded as he heard his grandfather's voice in the distance. It was faint but unmistakable. He turned toward the sound, his small hands trembling. The group of K9 German shepherds around him remained still, their eyes locked on him as if waiting for his next move. Bob, the leader of the pack, gave him another gentle nudge, his dark brown eyes filled with something Henry could only describe as reassurance. The other dogs stood firm, their ears flicking at every noise in the forest, alert to any possible danger. The little boy sniffled and wiped his face with his sleeve. He had been so afraid just moments ago, lost and alone on this quiet road. But now, surrounded by these powerful yet gentle creatures, something deep inside told him he was safe. With a deep breath, Henry took a small step forward. The moment he did, the German shepherds moved in perfect synchronization, forming a protective barrier around him. Two walked ahead, two followed behind, and Bob stayed close at his side. It was as if they had silently agreed they would guide him home. Henry's tiny feet shuffled on the gravel as he tried to walk faster. He didn't know how long he had been lost, but the fading sunlight told him it had been too long. He needed to get back before it got dark. As they moved down the road, the shepherds kept a tight formation, their ears twitching at every rustling branch and distant bird call. Henry noticed how disciplined they were. No dog ran ahead. No one strayed too far. It was almost like they had done this before. Then, suddenly, one of the dogs growled. Henry froze, his eyes darting around, trying to see what had made the dog react. Bob stiffened, his body tense, his sharp gaze locked on the trees lining the road. His ears pointed forward, completely focused. The other shepherds followed his lead, their muscles coiled like springs, ready to act. Henry's breath hitched. Was there something in the forest? A twig snapped. The little boy's heart nearly stopped. Then movement. A dark shape emerged from the trees, stepping onto the road. Henry gasped, stumbling backward. It was a coyote. The animal was thin, its fur ragged, its yellow eyes scanning the scene before it. It had probably been drawn by Henry's scent, or maybe it had heard him crying earlier. Either way, it had found them now. For a long moment, there was silence. The coyote stood frozen, considering its options. Henry clutched the fabric of his shirt, trying to make himself as small as possible. Then, Bob took a step forward. The change was immediate. The once calm shepherd now stood tall and imposing, his entire body rigid, his stance firm. His deep chest expanded as he let out a low, rumbling growl warning. The other K9S followed suit, each one stepping in sync, their hackles raised, their eyes locked on the coyote. Their growls filled the air, a sound so primal and united that the coyote instantly recoiled. Henry had never seen anything like it. It was as if the dogs had formed an impenetrable wall, standing between him and the wild animal. They weren't just protecting him, they were claiming this space as their own. The coyote lowered its head, ears flat, tail twitching nervously. It hesitated for a second too long. Then Bob barked. The sound was sharp, powerful, and full of authority. The coyote yelped and bolted back into the forest, disappearing into the underbrush. Silence fell again, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Henry let out the breath he had been holding. The K9S didn't move at first. They remained in their protective stance, ensuring the threat was truly gone. Slowly, Bob turned to look at Henry. The moment their eyes met, the boy understood exactly what had just happened. They had protected him. A small smile flickered on Henry's lips. His tiny fingers reached out and gently touched Bob's thick fur. The dog let out a soft huff, almost as if to say, "You're safe now." Then, in the distance, another sound closer this time. "Henry! Henry!" His grandfather's voice. The little boy turned, his heart leaping in his chest. "Grandpa!" he cried, breaking into a run. The shepherds didn't stop him. Instead, they followed, keeping their protective formation as he rushed toward the approaching figure. And there, under the last rays of the setting sun, Henry finally found himself wrapped in his grandfather's arms. The old man's hands trembled as he held Henry close. "I was so worried," he whispered. "How did you find your way back?" Henry sniffled, looking up with a smile. "Bob and the other dogs," he said. "They saved me." His grandfather looked up, his eyes widening as he saw the pack of shepherds standing silently behind Henry. His gaze locked onto Bob, the leader of the group, and something in his expression shifted. Recognition. The old man took a shaky breath. Bob simply tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes steady, as if acknowledging an old friend. Tears welled up in the grandfather's eyes as he rested a hand on Bob's head. "You were a hero before, and you still are." Henry beamed as he hugged Bob. "Can he stay, Grandpa?" The old man smiled, nodding. "I think Bob has already made his choice." And with that, Henry knew Bob wasn't just a dog. He was family. Henry Marshall clung tightly to his mother's arms, his small body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. He had been so lost, so afraid. And then Bob and the other canine German shepherds had appeared like silent guardians from the shadows. They had protected him, guided him, and now they were vanishing just as mysteriously as they had come. His mother, Evelyn, held him close, her tears mixing with the rain that had begun to drizzle softly against the windshield. "You're safe," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "That's all that matters." Henry wiped his tear-streaked face and turned toward the window. "Mommy, did you see them?" Evelyn nodded, still shaken. "I saw them, sweetheart. But where did they come from?" Henry's wide eyes stayed locked on the road as the pack of German shepherds moved as one, their powerful strides keeping pace with the car. At the front of the formation was Bob, the leader, his piercing gaze unwavering, his movements calculated. It was almost as if he had made a silent promise to see the boy home safely. A shiver ran down Evelyn's spine, not from fear, but from awe. These dogs were unlike any she had ever seen. They were disciplined, trained, purposeful. But why had they helped Henry? Why had they chosen him? "Mommy," Henry whispered, voice barely above a breath. "I think they want us to follow them." Evelyn hesitated. It was crazy chasing after a pack of unknown dogs in the middle of the night, but something about this felt bigger than logic. It felt important. With a slow inhale, she tightened her grip on the wheel. "All right," she murmured, pressing the gas just enough to match their pace. "Let's see where they lead us." The drive was eerie. The forest loomed on either side of the winding road, its branches reaching like fingers into the darkness. The rain had thickened, making the road slick, but the shepherds never faltered. They ran with precision, their paws barely making a sound against the wet gravel. Then, just ahead, Bob let out a sharp bark. The entire pack shifted, veering off the road toward an overgrown path leading into the trees. Evelyn slowed the car. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. "Henry, stay in the car." But, stay," she said firmly. Then, against every rational thought in her head, she grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the night. Bob stood at the edge of the trees, waiting. When Evelyn took a hesitant step forward, he turned and disappeared into the forest. The other dogs followed, their movements swift and silent. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to take Henry home. But something deeper, something primal pushed her forward. The rain pattered against the leaves as she navigated the narrow path, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The dogs moved ahead, weaving through the undergrowth with ease. Then, suddenly, they stopped. Evelyn's breath hitched. A rusted metal structure stood in the clearing, a small, long-abandoned shed. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking as the wind nudged it. Bob turned, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. Then, with deliberate patience, he nudged the door open with his muzzle. Evelyn swallowed hard and stepped inside. At first, the dim light revealed nothing but scattered debris, old wooden crates, discarded tools, and remnants of what had once been a hunter's outpost. But then, a sound. A whimper. Evelyn's stomach dropped. She swept the flashlight across the room until the beam landed on a small, shivering figure curled up against the back wall. A child. "Oh my God!" Evelyn gasped, rushing forward. The boy looked up, his face streaked with dirt and tears. He couldn't have been older than 5, his clothes soaked and tattered. He flinched at first, but when he saw the dogs, when he saw Bob, he let out a sob of relief. They found me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Evelyn's hands shook as she pulled her phone from her pocket, dialing 911. "My name is Evelyn Marshall. I found a missing child in the woods. Please send help." The dispatcher's voice crackled through the rain, assuring her that officers were on their way. Evelyn turned back to the boy, wrapping her coat around his frail body. "You're safe now," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You're going home." Bob sat beside them, his presence grounding. He had led her here. He had saved this child. Minutes later, the wail of sirens echoed through the trees. Flashing red and blue lights danced against the wet leaves as officers rushed into the clearing. "Ma'am, step back," one of them instructed, moving toward the boy. But when he caught sight of the shepherds, he froze. His expression shifted from confusion to realization. "Those dogs, those are the missing K9S." Evelyn blinked. "Missing?" The officer nodded, stepping closer. A K9 unit was involved in a case nearby, but the dogs disappeared during a chaotic pursuit. "We thought we lost them." Bob let out a low huff, as if to say, "Not lost. Just on a mission." The boy was quickly taken into the arms of paramedics, his frail form wrapped in warm blankets. As the officers assessed the situation, one knelt beside Bob, running a hand over his wet fur. "Looks like you found your way back to duty, old boy." Evelyn turned to Henry, who had stepped out of the car, his small hands clutching his mother's sleeve. "They were meant to find him," he whispered, awe in his voice. Evelyn knelt, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "And they found you too." As the last of the officers loaded the boy into the ambulance, Bob and the other shepherds stood tall, watching their work come to an end. Then, with one final glance at Henry, Bob turned and trotted toward the lead officer. He was ready to go home. Henry smiled as he watched them disappear into the night, knowing deep down that this wasn't just luck. It was fate. And Bob? He was more than just a dog. He was a guardian. Henry Marshall tightened his grip on Ethan's hand, his pulse hammering as the heavy silence inside the abandoned K9 unit headquarters pressed against them. Dust swirled in the dim light of his phone's flashlight, illuminating remnants of a past long-forgotten scattered papers, rusted lockers, and the faint scent of damp wood mixed with something deeper, something lost. Bob, the largest of the German shepherds, stood a few steps ahead, his body tense yet calm, his dark eyes scanning the room. The other K9S moved with an eerie sense of purpose, weaving through the debris like ghosts reclaiming their territory. It was as if they knew every inch of this place, as if they had been waiting for someone to return. Henry swallowed hard. The realization settled in his gut like a stone. These dogs, Bob and the others, had once belonged here. They had trained here, served here. But when the station shut down, when the officers packed their bags and left, these loyal animals had been abandoned. Yet, they had survived. Ethan's small voice broke the silence. "Daddy, they never left, did they?" Henry looked down at his son, the boy's wide eyes reflecting the uncertainty and wonder in his own heart. "No, buddy," he murmured. "They didn't." Bob let out a quiet huff, his ears flicking toward the far side of the room. He turned sharply, trotting toward a door at the end of the hall. The other shepherds followed in perfect unison. Henry hesitated. "Do we follow them?" Ethan's grip tightened around his father's fingers. "They brought us here for a reason." Taking a deep breath, Henry nodded and led his son forward, their steps echoing against the tiled floor. The dogs stopped in front of the door, their bodies still but alert. Bob placed a paw against it and let out a low whine. Henry reached for the handle. Unlike the front door, this one was locked. A cold shiver crawled down his spine. Why lead them to a locked door? Before he could think further, Bob stepped back, and one of the smaller shepherds, an agile, wiry dog with a scar over one eye, lunged forward, hitting the door with its powerful front legs. The lock groaned but held. A second attempt sent the door crashing open. Henry's heart pounded as he raised his phone's flashlight, its narrow beam cutting through the darkness. The room was different from the others. Unlike the dust-covered remains of the station, this space had been disturbed. Blankets were piled in one corner, a few empty food cans scattered across the floor. Scratches marred the walls. Someone or something had been here. And recently, a metallic click snapped through the air. Henry instinctively pulled Ethan behind him, his breath catching as his eyes locked onto a figure in the corner of the room. A man, disheveled and gaunt, crouched low, his hands trembling over a rusted tin. His sunken eyes darted between Henry and the dogs, panic flashing across his face. "Who are you?" Henry demanded, stepping forward just enough to shield Ethan but not provoke the dogs. The man exhaled sharply, his voice hoarse. I used to be their handler." His gaze flickered to Bob, something breaking in his expression. "I never meant to leave them." Henry's stomach twisted. "You were with the K9 unit?" The man nodded, wiping a hand over his unshaven face. "Officer Dean Holloway. I worked this unit for 10 years. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "When the station shut down, they told us the dogs would be rehomed, sent to other departments or adopted out. I fought it. I fought hard. But in the end, his voice cracked. They just left them here." Henry exchanged a glance with Ethan, who clung to his father's side, eyes brimming with confusion. The dogs hadn't just survived on their own. They had been waiting, watching, protecting the only home they had ever known. Dean swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I tried coming back, but I lost everything. No badge, no home, no money. I couldn't take care of them." His shoulders sagged, but they never left. Bob stepped forward, his deep brown eyes locking onto Dean's. The man reached out hesitantly, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the dog's thick fur. Bob didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned into the touch, a quiet understanding passing between them. Henry exhaled. "They waited for you." Dean let out a shaky breath. "Yeah," he whispered. "They did." The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken emotions. Then, finally, Henry squared his shoulders. "We can't leave them here," he said firmly. "Or you." Dean blinked, as if struggling to process the words. I don't deserve." "Doesn't matter," Henry cut him off. "They still believe in you. That's enough." Ethan, his small face filled with determination, stepped forward. "Come home with us," he said simply. Dean looked between the boy, Henry, and the pack of loyal K9Es that had never given up on him. Slowly, he nodded. That night, for the first time in years, the dogs did not sleep in the cold. Dean Holloway, their lost handler, did not spend another night alone. And Henry Marshall knew without a doubt that fate had led them here for a reason. Because some bonds, no matter how broken, are never truly lost. They just wait to be found again. James Parker ran a shaking hand over Maximus's thick fur, the weight of years pressing down on him like a storm cloud. His voice was quiet, laced with regret. "When the department shut down, they told me the K9 unit would be reassigned. But when the funding ran dry, they were just forgotten." His jaw clenched, his fingers gripping Maximus's collar. "I fought to keep them," I begged. "But paperwork and bureaucracy don't care about loyalty." Maximus pressed closer, resting his massive head against Parker's shoulder, as if forgiving him for a mistake he had never been able to correct. Emily's throat tightened. She glanced at the abandoned station, now nothing more than a shell of what it once was. These dogs had stayed. No one had fed them, cared for them, yet they had endured. They had remained guardians of a place that had long since left them behind. "They survived on their own all this time?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Parker let out a humorless chuckle. "Survived?" He shook his head. "They protected this place, each other. That's what they were trained to do. And they never stopped." Ethan stepped forward, his small hands curling into fists. "So you can take them home now, right?" His voice carried the innocence of a child who believed in happy endings. Parker hesitated. He looked at the dogs, the only family he had ever truly trusted. I don't know if I can." Emily's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" The former canine officer exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "I lost my badge years ago. I don't have the resources to care for 6 working dogs. They deserve more than a cramped backyard and whatever scraps I can afford." His voice dropped lower. "They deserve a real purpose." The words felt like a slap to Emily's chest. These dogs had given everything, and now, when they had finally found their way back to the man they had been waiting for, they were at risk of being abandoned all over again. Before she could speak, Maximus lifted his head sharply, his ears pricked. The other shepherds tensed, their bodies shifting, alert. Something wasn't right. Then, from the darkness, came the sound of footsteps. A new threat looms. Emily's heart pounded. She instinctively pulled Ethan behind her, her protective instincts flaring. Parker was already on his feet, his stance rigid. The shepherds growled in unison, forming a wall in front of them. Then, a low voice broke through the silence. Well, didn't expect company." A figure emerged from the shadows near the side of the building. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar running down his jaw. Another man followed, a wiry, twitchy-looking character, whose fingers kept shifting inside his jacket. Emily's stomach twisted. These weren't just some lost hikers. Parker's eyes darkened. "What are you doing here?" The scarred man smirked. "Could ask you the same thing." His gaze flickered toward the shepherds. "Been tracking these dogs for weeks. Didn't expect to find their old handler standing in my way." A sickening realization settled over Emily. These men weren't just loitering. They had been watching. "They don't belong to you," Parker said coldly. Scarface chuckled. "See, that's where you're wrong." He pulled a folded document from his pocket. "These dogs were never legally adopted out after the shutdown. Technically, they're still property of the state. And lucky for me, I got a few connections." Emily's blood ran cold. He was here to take them. Maximus let out a deep, threatening growl. The other shepherds mirrored him, their bodies coiled like springs ready to launch. Scarface took a step back but didn't look worried. "Relax, old man. We don't want trouble. Just the dogs. They're worth a fortune, trained like this." He grinned. "K9s fetch a high price overseas." Emily felt Ethan grip her arm tighter. She couldn't let this happen. Parker took a deliberate step forward, his face unreadable. "You think you can just walk in here and take them?" Scarface's smirk widened. "Who's gonna stop me?" Parker exhaled slowly. Then he looked down at Maximus. "Bob," he said, his voice low but commanding. A signal. Bob, the second largest shepherd, lunged. The next few seconds were chaos. The shepherds moved in perfect unison, their training kicking in with deadly precision. Bob and Titan flanked Scarface before he could react, knocking him off balance. Maximus barreled into the wiry man, sending him crashing into the dirt. Parker moved fast, kicking away the gun Scarface had been reaching for. "Not today," he muttered, pinning the man's wrist with a practiced grip. Ethan gasped, gripping his mother's hand. "Mommy, they're fighting for us." Emily's breath came fast, but she nodded. "Yes, baby. They are." The shepherds held their positions, teeth bared, watching for any sudden movements. Scarface struggled but stilled when Bob's teeth hovered inches from his throat. Parker reached into his pocket, pulling out his old badge. "You have the right to remain silent, but I suggest you use it." The road home. By the time the sheriff arrived, Scarface and his accomplice were already subdued. Witness statements were taken, the abandoned station was marked for official investigation, and arrangements were made. Parker stood beside Emily, watching as the shepherds sat obediently by his side, their eyes locked onto him, waiting. "You're taking them home," Emily said, not as a question, but as a fact. Parker swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yeah," he murmured. "I am." Ethan beamed. "They belong with you." Parker looked down at Maximus and Bob. "Yeah," he whispered. "They do." As the police cars pulled away and the night returned to quiet, Parker let out a breath he'd been holding for years. The past had come full circle. His dogs had waited for him. And now, he would never leave them again. Sometimes, family isn't just about blood. It's about loyalty. And some bonds, no matter how long they're tested, can never be broken. And as the shepherds walked beside him, no longer lost, no longer abandoned, Parker knew one thing for certain. They were finally home. Henry Marshall walked with slow, measured steps, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. The moon cast a silvery glow over the abandoned K9 station, highlighting the faded insignia that had once symbolized loyalty, bravery, and brotherhood. But now, it was nothing more than a forgotten relic. Behind him, a formation of German shepherds moved in unison, silent, disciplined, unwavering. Bob, the largest of the pack, stayed by Henry's side, his sharp brown eyes locked onto him as if making sure this moment was real. They were finally leaving. Emily held Ethan's hand tightly as they followed Henry and the pack down the narrow path leading back to the road. The night air carried a mix of emotions, relief, hope, and a lingering sadness that clung to the walls of the abandoned station like a ghost. Ethan, unable to contain his excitement, beamed up at Henry. "They're really coming with us?" Henry glanced down at the boy, then back at the dogs who had spent years living in the shadows. He nodded. "Yeah, kid, they're finally going home." The shepherds moved in perfect synchronization, years of training still ingrained in them despite the hardships they had endured. They didn't need leashes. They didn't need commands. They knew where they belonged. But just as they reached the road, Bob suddenly stopped. The other shepherds followed his lead, their bodies tensing. Their ears perked. Henry's pulse quickened. He knew that stance. Something wasn't right. A shadow in the dark. Emily felt her stomach knot as she saw the way the dogs reacted. They were trained to protect, to sense danger before it arrived. "What is it?" she whispered, gripping Ethan's hand tighter. Henry's jaw clenched as he followed Bob's gaze toward the road ahead. A car sat parked at an angle near the tree line, its headlights off. At first glance, it seemed abandoned, but Henry knew better. Someone was inside. The shepherds formed a protective wall in front of Ethan and Emily, their muscles coiled like springs, ready to react. Then the car door opened. A figure stepped out, a tall man with a thick jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His movements were slow, calculated. Henry immediately stepped forward, shielding Emily and Ethan with his body. His voice was low but firm. "Can I help you?" The man took a long drag from a cigarette before flicking it onto the pavement. "Didn't expect to see anyone here this late." His voice was casual, but there was something off about it, too smooth, too rehearsed. Henry's gut twisted. The man's eyes flicked to the German shepherds, lingering just a second too long. "I heard about these dogs," he continued, tilting his head. "Real valuable animals." Emily's breath hitched. She saw it now, the way his stance shifted slightly, the way his fingers flexed at his side. Henry took a slow step forward. "They're not for sale." The man smirked. "That's a shame." The shepherds let out a low, unified growl. The man's smirk faltered. He took a step back, his eyes darting toward his car. He hadn't expected them to have backup. Henry's voice was ice. "I suggest you get in your car and drive away." The man hesitated, as if weighing his options. Then, finally, he scoffed and threw up his hands. "Relax, old man. Just making conversation." But as he turned and slid back into his car, Henry didn't miss the way his fingers gripped the wheel a little too tight. The engine roared to life, tires kicking up dust as the car peeled away, disappearing into the night. Only when the red taillights vanished over the hill did the shepherds relax. Henry exhaled, running a hand over his face. Emily turned to him, her voice shaky. "Who was that?" Henry shook his head. "I don't know. But I don't think this is over." Bob stepped forward, pressing his head against Henry's leg, a silent reassurance. Ethan, still wide-eyed, clutched at his mother's coat. "Will they try to take the dogs?" Henry looked down at him, then at the pack that had once been abandoned by the world. "Not if I have anything to say about it." A new beginning. By the time they reached Henry's property, dawn was beginning to creep over the horizon. His land stretched wide, surrounded by open fields and thick trees, a perfect place for the shepherds to reclaim their freedom. The moment the car doors opened, the dogs leapt out, their paws hitting the grass for the first time in what felt like forever. Bob was the first to take off, racing across the field with an energy that made Henry's chest tighten. The others followed, their tails wagging, their bodies finally free from the weight of survival. Ethan laughed, running after them. They looked so happy. Emily stepped beside Henry, watching the scene unfold. "So what now?" Henry crossed his arms, watching Bob and the others roll in the grass like puppies. "Now," he let out a breath. "Now, we start over." She smiled. "You think they'll adjust?" Henry glanced at Bob, who had stopped running and was now sitting near the porch, watching him with those sharp, knowing eyes. "They already have." As the morning sun bathed the land in golden light, the pass faded behind them. The K9S had found their way home, and Henry Marshall, a man who had once believed he had lost everything, realized that maybe, just maybe, life had given him a second chance too. Some bonds can never be broken, and some loyalties never fade. And as Henry watched Bob trot toward him, his tail wagging ever so slightly, he knew they were finally where they were meant to be. Home. Ethan, sitting in the back seat, watched them with wide eyes. "Mommy," he whispered, barely able to contain his excitement. "Do you think they know?" Emily smiled softly, glancing at the rearview mirror. Bob sat at the edge of the truck bed, his head high, his sharp eyes locked on the road ahead. His posture was regal, as if he were leading them all to the place they had always belonged. "I think they've always known where home was," she said gently. "They just needed someone to bring them back." 30 minutes later, they pulled onto Henry's land, a vast stretch of rolling fields, enclosed by sturdy fencing. The barn stood tall, warm light glowing from within. Unlike the abandoned station, this place wasn't just a memory. It was alive. Henry slowed his truck to a stop near a spacious outdoor kennel. He turned off the engine and stepped out, taking a deep breath as he surveyed the land. This was it. The K9S had waited years for this moment. Emily parked beside him and barely had time to unbuckle before Ethan was scrambling out, running toward the truck bed. "Are they going to stay here forever?" he asked, his voice laced with hope. Henry placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder and smiled. "They'll stay as long as they want. They've earned that much." One by one, the shepherds leapt down, their paws pressing into the grass. They hesitated at first, sniffing the air, scanning the open space as if trying to decide if this was real. Then, something changed. Bob let out a low huff and trotted forward, his tail wagging slightly. The others followed, first tentatively, then with more confidence. Then, in a moment so pure it sent shivers down Emily's spine, they ran. Not to chase, not to hunt, not out of fear. They ran because they were free. Henry watched as the shepherds raced across the field, weaving between the trees, their powerful legs stretching with a newfound lightness. It was the first time in years they had moved without purpose, without duty. They were just dogs now. Emily pressed a hand to her heart. She had seen many things in her life, but nothing quite like this. Bob, the leader who had carried the weight of their survival, turned back. His piercing eyes locked onto Henry, holding his gaze for a long moment. Then, with complete trust, the massive shepherd lay down at Henry's feet. Ethan beamed. He knows he's home. Henry knelt beside Bob, running a hand over his thick fur. "Yeah," he whispered. "They all do." The other shepherds, one by one, came to rest beside their leader. Their waiting was over. And finally, they were home. The lesson of loyalty and second chances, what the canine shepherds teach us about life. The story of Henry Marshall, Bob, and the abandoned canine German shepherds is more than just a tale of survival, loyalty, and redemption. It mirrors many struggles we see in our own lives. It reminds us that even when the world forgets us, even when we feel discarded and alone, there is always hope for a second chance. The perseverance of these dogs, their unwavering dedication to each other, and their ability to trust again despite betrayal carry powerful lessons that apply to our human experiences. In today's fast-paced society, people are often discarded when they are no longer seen as useful. Workers who have given decades to a company find themselves replaced by automation or younger employees. Veterans who once served with honor return home to a world that struggles to reintegrate them. The elderly, once the pillars of wisdom and family strength, often feel isolated as the world around them moves on too quickly. Like those forgotten canines, so many individuals are left to fend for themselves, struggling to find purpose again. But just as Bob and his pack never stop protecting what they believe to be their home, we too must hold on to what gives us meaning. The shepherds could have turned wild. They could have abandoned their training, but instead, they stuck together, surviving against all odds. Similarly, in our own hardships, we can lean on the bonds we have, friendships, family, or even our own sense of identity to push forward, even when the world seems indifferent. The most touching part of the story is not just that the dogs were rescued, but that they were willing to trust again. Bob, the leader, had every reason to remain wary of humans. After all, he and his pack had been abandoned. But when Henry came back, when the man they had once served returned, they didn't let bitterness win. They allowed themselves to believe in kindness again. This teaches us that while betrayal and disappointment are inevitable in life, we should never close ourselves off completely. Healing takes time, and trust may be slow to rebuild, but we should never let the pain of the past prevent us from embracing new opportunities for love and connection. The ending of the story also highlights the importance of purpose. Once rehomed, the shepherds didn't just exist, they thrived. They ran freely, they reclaimed their instincts, they found joy in simply being. Many of us, especially as we grow older, struggle with the idea of purpose. Society often convinces us that our best years are behind us, that once we retire, once our children grow up, once we can no longer move as fast as we used to, we become irrelevant. But this story reminds us that purpose doesn't end, it simply changes. Just like the canines, we must allow ourselves to embrace new roles, new joys, and new reasons to wake up every day. Whether that means passing down wisdom to younger generations, finding new hobbies, or simply choosing to live with gratitude, we all have something left to give. At its core, this story isn't just about forgotten dogs. It's about all of us. About finding our way back when we feel lost. About trusting again when we've been hurt. About rediscovering joy after years of struggle. It is a testament to the fact that, no matter how much time has passed or how much we have endured, we are never truly forgotten, and we are never beyond the chance to start anew. If this story touched your heart, let me know in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe for more tales that inspire and move us. Thank you for being part of this journey. See you in the next story.